So let's get started. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jay McTighe. He has been remarkable. I had the joy of meeting him 2 years ago. Jay McTighe brings a wealth of experience developed during a rich and varied career in education. He served as director of Maryland Assessment Consortium, a state collaboration of school districts working together to develop and share formative instruction and practices and analysis around student data. He is an accomplished author, having co-authored 14 books, including the award-winning best-selling Understanding by Design series with Grant Wiggins. His books have been translated into 10 languages. He has also written more than 35 articles and book chapters and been in many published leading journals. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jay. Jay, it's you.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. And welcome to everyone who's joined, morning, afternoon, evening. I'm going to need, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. And give me a second to make sure it's coming across. Tracy, thumbs up if you can see my full screen now. Is that showing? Okay. Welcome to everyone. I'm not coming from the universe. I'm from Columbia, Maryland in the mid-Atlantic. But I know there are people from literally all over the world here, so I'm honored to be with you. I'm going to ask you one more favor if you are so inclined. If you could put into the chat box a symbol or just a short letter or number for your role. So for example, if you're an elementary teacher and you teach 3rd grade, you could put E3. If you're a middle or high school teacher, you could put M or H and a symbol for your subject. So WL for world language, SC for science. For those of you who are in administrative roles, for instance, if you're a vice principal, you could put administrator, VP, or AP. A district role, it might be curriculum director, CD, etc. Just to see who is joined us in terms of position. So I'd like to invite you to do that. And as you do, let me jump right into the ideas that I'll be sharing with you during this keynote. I like to frame content through questions. So I have 4 key questions I'd like to explore with you during the next 55 minutes. And I'm hoping this will set the stage for some of the more detailed information you'll get from subsequent speakers. So one question I think is a presiding one, an overarching one is, what are the goals for modern learning? What should we be thinking about as priorities for preparing today's students for this ever-changing world? A related question, what evidence for this learning do we need? Clarity about our goals and the priorities of a modern education impacts what and how we assess. And I'm going to talk about assessment evidence briefly. Thirdly, here's a provocation. I propose that we're ready to rethink our conception of curriculum mapping. And I'm going to offer what I describe as curriculum mapping 3.0, and I'll explain that shortly. And finally, what does it mean for instruction and how we teach? And how might we actively engage learners in what I like to call making meaning of important ideas and processes? These are 4 key questions that I'll explore during the course of my time with you, and other speakers will elaborate, no doubt, on these various points. The ideas I'm bringing to you are fundamentally drawn from 3 books. One is my work over the years on Understanding by Design with Grant Wiggins, and I'll use a, quote, backward design construct to frame the content of my talk. The center book is the one that most specifically and directly addresses a lot of the ideas I'll be sharing. It's called Leading Modern Learning. And a related book on the bottom right, Designing Authentic Performance Tasks and Projects. And I want to highlight the subtitle, Tools for Meaningful Learning and Assessment. So I'm drawing from these books. As Tracy mentioned, you are invited to submit questions, but use the Q&A box rather than the chat box for that purpose. And we'll be monitoring that, and we'll have a little time at the end for answers to any questions you pose. All right, as I mentioned, I'm going to use the ideas of UBD to frame my talk, and it would help me, one more request, if you could put into the chat box your familiarity, if any, with the Understanding by Design framework. It's not required to be part of this session by any means, but it just helps me to know kind of your familiarity. So if you're new to UBD, you may have heard the phrase, but don't know much about it, you would put 1 in the chat box. You've had some familiarity or an introduction to Understanding by Design, but you're not using it all the time in your work, would be a 2. 3 would describe those of you who not only learned about Understanding by Design, but you use it. As a teacher, you plan use units using backward design. And as a school or district person, you're using UBD to frame your curriculum. And 4 would describe experts who teach workshops or courses in Understanding by Design. So again, thank you for, this is my pre-assessment, just to get a sense of your familiarity. But again, it's not required. So let me begin with just a couple of key points about Understanding by Design and use that as an entree into the content of this session. The key ideas of Understanding by Design, or UBD, are in its title. Since our framework was first proposed more than 25 years ago, Grant Wiggins and I contend that a modern education, especially now, should be focusing on developing and deepening student understanding of important concepts and processes, ultimately so they can transfer their learning. Now, to say that we want to focus on understanding and transfer in no way is meant to suggest that we no longer care about factual knowledge or basic skills. Clearly, these are foundational, and a person can't do much without the basics. But I like to think of the basics as the floor, not the ceiling of a modern education. I contend that a modern education should ultimately be preparing students for transfer, to be able to take what they've learned and apply it effectively and appropriately to new situations. But you can't transfer something that you don't understand. If all you have is rote learning, all you can do is give back what was told to you in the way it was told. But rote learning, in my view, will not prepare students for today's world. They need to be able to transfer their learning, and that requires understanding. The second big idea in Understanding by Design is in its title, and that's by design. And many of you are familiar with the concept of backward design. Grant Wiggins and I propose a 3-stage planning process that we call backward design for planning curriculum. And you can use this as a teacher to plan a unit of study with lessons embedded. You can use this to plan a project, as in project-based learning. You can use this as a district curriculum committee to plan a 12 to pre-K curriculum. It's a generic but effective planning process. Pardon me. Briefly, here are the 3 stages that we've described as backward design. Number 1, we identify desired results. Well, of course, any teacher teaching anything should have goals or outcomes in mind. But there's some nuances in Understanding by Design that I'll highlight shortly. Stage 2 of backward design in some ways is at the heart of this process, because stage 2 asks us to think like assessors and ask a straightforward question. If these are the goals or the outcomes we're after for learning, what evidence will show that students have achieved these? And because we have different goal types, we need evidence of knowledge, skills, but we also need evidence that students understand and can transfer or apply that learning. With clarity about our goals and the assessment evidence that supports those goals, we then plan our teaching. Day-to-day teacher planning, lesson planning, etc., falls in stage 3. But the logic of backward design is crystal clear. Don't start planning activities, marching through a textbook, or even working on a project without clarity about the goals for that learning and awareness of the assessment evidence that will show the extent to which students have achieved those goals. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, let me use backward design as a construct for the ideas in this session, beginning with stage 1, or this question. What are the goals for modern education? Now, in many ways, I'm think I'm speaking to a choir for those of you who signed up for this webinar, but nonetheless, let me make the case if need be. Pardon me. In our work on understanding by design, Grant Wiggins and I propose that we can think about three categorically different, although related, goals for learning. And these should be familiar to everyone, but let me highlight. In the upper left, we have what I call acquisition goals. Namely, what, pardon me, what content knowledge, and that includes factual knowledge and basic concepts, as well as skills, and that includes basic skills, should students acquire when they're learning new material? Well, again, every teacher ought to have goals and objectives toward which they're teaching. And if you are obligated to state or national standards or provincial outcomes, they specify, often in great detail, knowledge and skill objectives. But on the right side, we have another goal type, which I like to call understanding goals. An understanding is more than just remembering a fact, and it's not quite a skill. It's a larger transferable idea. And thirdly, we have transfer, the ability for a student to take what they learned and effectively apply that learning to something new. So these are three interrelated but not identical goals. And goal clarity, we know, is important to teaching and learning. And the impact, or the import, I should say, of these goal distinctions matters. It matters in terms of how kids develop these things, which has implications for how we teach. And it also matters for assessment. I hope you would agree that if I want to see if a student knows something, an objective test or quiz or question will show that, because knowledge is binary, right? You know it or you don't. But if I want to see if a student really understands and can apply their learning, I need something more than just a factual recall kinds of test. So these distinctions matter. One related point, thumbs up if you know the name Dr. John Hattie, Hattie. John Hattie, some of you know, is a researcher from New Zealand, spent his entire career, more than 35 years now, studying, teaching, and learning at the university level, and has written a series of books that he describes as visible learning, in which Hattie describes from his research analysis what he calls the effect sizes of different teaching techniques. So how effective is cooperative learning or reciprocal teaching or concept attainment, et cetera, in improving student achievement. Anyway, I've gotten to know John in recent years, and he sent me an article that relates to this topic. And so I wanted to highlight it for you. These are John Hattie's words with my graphic. John Hattie says, in all my years studying, teaching, and learning, I've concluded that we can think about three levels of learning for the student. John says there's surface level learning, which he describes as learning when the teacher presents new information to students, or they might read it in a textbook, or they might view it online. But Hattie reminds us, if the student simply takes in new information but doesn't do anything with it, it's not likely to last. It will remain on the surface and eventually fade from memory. Then John Hattie says there's deep learning, which he defines, as I do, as learning with and for understanding. Now, we know it takes time for students to really come to understand something deeply, but once they do, it lasts. Grant Wiggins and I refer to this as enduring understanding. And finally, Hattie agrees with Grant Wiggins and I when he says the deepest learning is evident when students can transfer. So this is one of the leading researchers in our profession, highlighting what to me has been an underpinning of understanding by design and good teaching over the years. Another recent book of mine is one I'm very proud of. It's called Teaching for Deeper Learning. And in that book, my colleague, Dr. Harvey Silver, and I adopted the definition of deeper learning proposed by the National Research Council. Take a moment just to look at their definition on the screen. The National Research Council is echoing a similar theme, the importance of transfer, which is the essence of how they define deeper learning. So let me play this out in a little more detail. What's worth deep learning? What should be the goals of a modern education? Permit me to get personal for a moment. These are three of my four grandchildren. Baby James on the left, little Sage in the middle, and baby Hendrix on the right. And I think about them a lot in terms of what kind of education do I hope and wish for them? Well, one of my favorite quotations makes a comment here, purportedly a Chinese proverb. And we recognize this. The world is much different than the one in which many of us came up. And some of the factors that we know are impactful impact or influence a modern education. Permit me to cite a few, but these should be familiar to everyone. Some years ago, the British intellect Buckminster Fuller identified a concept that he called the knowledge doubling curve. And he proposed that from the beginning of recorded history through the 1900s, knowledge doubled about every century. But then knowledge expansion increased exponentially. I've seen estimates that the world's knowledge is doubling every few years. I'm not sure how to quantify that, but what we do know is clear. There's more knowledge, information, if you will, than ever before, and it continues to grow. Relatedly, access to the world's information has never been greater, and we can access much of that on a handheld device, even a wrist device in some cases. Dick Tracy is alive and well today. We also know that the world is unpredictable. The recent pandemic is just one sobering reminder that things that we aren't expecting can emerge, and we have to be able to deal with them. Transfer, not rote learning, will be required. We know the evolution of technologies, whether it's the Internet of Things and the interconnectedness of devices, the confluence of big data, automation, and now artificial intelligence are significantly impacting our world, including the career opportunities that students will face and have as they go forward. Suffice it to say that preparation for this world, I believe, requires students who are able to effectively and appropriately navigate new opportunities and challenges, and that involves transfer. Again, I don't think I have to make the case for this audience, but if you want to make the case for others, here are a couple of interesting sources. One is the National Association of Colleges and Employers, otherwise the acronym is NACE, N-A-C-E. And every year or a couple of years, they come out with a response to a survey where employers and colleges are asked to highlight the key skill sets that are important in their world and in their organizations. This is from a couple of years ago, but you can see the things that they're calling for: problem-solving skills, ability to work in a team, communication skills, and so forth. Another related source is from the World Economic Forum. In this example, 10 skills important to the workforce of today: complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, coordinating with others. And you've seen lists like this, no doubt. And to me, they are giving us a clear message about the skill sets important to modern learning. Thumbs up if you work in a school or a district that has identified a so-called portrait of a graduate or profile of a learner, such as the one on the screen. I'm seeing this more and more around not only the US, but around the world, based on the recognition that while disciplinary knowledge and skills are critical, disciplines matter. There are competencies that cut across disciplines that also are important to today's world, and we need to be coordinating these and developing these by design, even as we work on more traditional academic knowledge and skills. Here's an example from one of the leading school districts in the US, Catalina Foothill School District that has developed a set of what they call their deep learning proficiencies, i.e. transfer goals. Collaboration, communication, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, systems thinking, self-regulation are their highlighted goals that cut across disciplines. So a couple of points about how this relates to the curriculum and the content we teach. On the screen is what may be a well-known finding from my longtime friend, Dr. Robert Marzano. In a meta-analysis that he conducted, Marzano concluded that the most significant factor at the school and district levels, and that's an important qualifier, school and district levels, not classroom, is what he called a guaranteed and viable curriculum delivered to all students. So when we think about what are the goals of modern learning, and we recognize that they're both disciplinary and trans or cross-disciplinary competencies that are important, we need to build those into the curriculum, and we need to make it guaranteed. Now, much of my work in my career has been around curriculum, and here's an analogy that relates. See if this works for you. In some schools, or even school districts, particularly smaller ones, teachers basically plan their curriculum, often working from standards or maybe guided by a textbook, but they plan their own units and lessons within. And that would be like creating a little square on the left side. In some schools and districts, teams work together, whether it's a grade level team or department team, and they might map out their whole year working as a team. And that would be like the square sets of patches on the right side. But what I contend is needed at the district level or the school level, if you're an independent school, is an overall pattern into which the individual squares and the team squares fit and cohere. In other words, this is what we talk about when we talk about by design. And because we have both disciplinary and what I call transdisciplinary goals, we need to build them in a coordinated way. And everyone in the district or everyone in the school should be clear about those ends and planning with them in mind. Planning with the end in mind is not just planning a unit or even a year. It's planning for the education that we collaboratively work on with students. Little sidebar note for those of you who are curriculum nerds, and there are a few of you on this webinar. The root meaning of the word curriculum is derived from Latin, and the root meaning is the course to be run. So think about that. If the curriculum is the course to be running, where is it running? What's its destination? And my practical definition is a curriculum is a plan to achieve designated goals, but we need to be clear about what those goals are. Now, when I work with schools and districts on curriculum, often when I ask, so let me see your existing or your current curriculum, often they'll send me to a website where I can see scope and sequence of content or standards laid out on calendar maps. And I get it. There's a need for scope and sequence. But my contention is just laying out a bunch of content to be covered according to a schedule is not the optimum way of thinking about a modern curriculum, and it can unwittingly promote a coverage orientation that could lead to superficial surface learning that doesn't last. So I'll give you my thoughts about a modern version of curriculum mapping shortly. But let me summarize what I've been saying thus far. I propose that at the school or district level or the program level, if you're working within a department, that you and your teammates or colleagues agree on a small number of what I call long-term transfer goals. The transfer goals specify what we want students to be able to do with their learning in the long run when they've graduated from our school or district. And the emphasis is on transfer. Transfer goals are what we hope they can do with their learning when they encounter new things. And the transfer goals are derived from academic disciplines, but they also will include those trans or cross-disciplinary competencies, often embedded in a portrait of a graduate or profile of a learner. In fact, these kinds of competencies are inherently transfer goals. We want to develop people who are critical thinkers, who won't just accept anything they see, hear, or view. I've been working with schools and districts on this as an overall curriculum process. And here's just one example of a poster created by a team, a curriculum team in Ramsey School District in New Jersey for one of their, they call it their profile of a graduate competencies of critical thinking. They've identified the key elements of how they're defining critical thinking: argumentation, reasoning, problem-solving, research. And then they identified a set of what I call overarching essential questions that are meant to be used by teachers, not just one time in one class, but over the grades. Questions like, how do I know when to believe in what I see, hear, and read? Is this a credible source? What other perspectives should I be considering? These are the essential questions that will develop and deepen critical thinking, and we would use it across the grades. Here's an example from Catalina Foothills, where they likewise had attractive, colorful posters that are used to highlight their competencies. And in both cases, in New Jersey and in Arizona, they post these around the schools, in the classrooms, even in the teachers' lounges, because we want to make sure everyone has the same end in mind. This is what we're collectively working toward. So here's another analogy. Think of long-term transfer goals, whether they're within disciplines or cut across disciplines, as the games you want students to play well when they've graduated. And like in athletics, every game is different, and the players have to adjust to the flow of the game. They have to transfer, in other words, everything they've learned in practice into an authentic performance. And that is a useful way of thinking about this idea. I'm going to come back to this. So one last point before I move into stage 2 of backward design and think about evidence. I'm going to come back to Bob Marzano's research finding, but notice I've highlighted the word viable. So what did Marzano mean by that? Why did he put that word in his statement? It was very deliberate. Well, I know because I've known Bob for more than 35 years. He put that word in because of his analysis of state standards that were out. Now, this was some time ago, but I contend that his finding and the word viable still apply. And his finding or his research showed something that anyone who's been in a classroom fully understands. Bob Marzano, in his analysis, found there was too much content jammed into state standards and not enough time to teach all that content well. And that, by the way, assumes that kids come in on grade level, which is not always the case. Grant Wiggins and I have always thought this was a curriculum challenge. And Marzano hit it head on with his word. He said, you can't have a viable curriculum if there's too much content and not enough time. So part of what I'm trying to endorse by identifying a small number of long-term transfer goals is to inject a prioritizing frame. Look, not all content is of equal value. Not all standards are of equal importance. We need a filter to clarify and focus the curriculum. And I'm saying, let's focus it around a small number of long-term transfer goals. So that's the key idea. To shift analogies once again, using a visual analogy, take a moment to ponder this photo. If we are teaching drivers, our long-term goals are producing safe, courteous, defensive, and adaptable drivers. If those are our transfer goals, kids don't need to know all the car parts. However, if our goal is auto mechanics, the content represented in the photo rises significantly in importance. My point is, clarity about our priorities matters, and we don't have to cover everything at least equally. Have long-term transfer in mind is my summary point. For your reference, there's an article that will be available to you. I think it's posted in a landing page after this session, in which I've described this concept in more detail with lots of examples. So hope that's useful. All right, let me move to stage 2 of backward design and my second question. If we're clear about the priorities for a modern education in terms of our learning goals, what evidence of learning do we need? Well, being a longtime student of assessment and assessment practices, here's yet another analogy. I contend that good assessment should be thought of more like a photo album than a snapshot. And think of it, any single assessment, be it a quiz, a test, a performance task, a project as in project-based learning, an observation, a skill check, any of those things can be like a snapshot, in that they give us a moment in time picture of what students know, understand, and can do. But because we have different goal types, we should have and we need a variety of types of evidence to fully assess all those goals. So on the screen is a familiar set of assessment types. We use them. They all have a purpose. But if we link our assessment evidence to our goals, we start recognizing that we need different kinds of photos in our album because we have different goal types. One of my favorite cartoons makes a humorous but serious point here. There's a place for multiple choice type assessments. They are quick, efficient, effective for certain things, but we recognize their limitations. They are not effective for things we value, whether it's innovative problem solving, design thinking, argumentation, oral communication, multimedia, projects, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like the cartoon, we need a supplement to the more traditional test models. Now, this isn't a new idea, and here's an analogy you could use when you get pushback from people who say, yeah, but our state test is all multiple choice, so that's all we should do. Think of the driver's test. In every state or province I know, there's two parts, right? There's a written test, often multiple choice, which is an appropriate way of gathering evidence about things the driver should know. But we also have a performance-based component to the driver's test, right? A performance assessment, because we want to also assess a driver's competence behind the wheel. So I think that analogy holds for schools. There's a place for multiple choice, even standardized testing. It can assess certain things well, but we know we need other types of evidence. So when we think about transfer and understanding as our goals, we need different evidence than just traditional fact type tests. In my book, Leading Modern Learning, I've written about the idea of what I call cornerstone tasks and projects. Like a cornerstone anchors a building, I'm suggesting that we anchor our curriculum around a set of rich performance tasks and projects. These tasks and projects require student understanding and call for application or transfer of learning. These are not tests of facts and skills. We can do those separately in more efficient ways. It's through authentic tasks and projects that we actually can build in and see evidence of student growth in those profile of a learner, profile of a graduate competencies that the world is calling for. So let me give you just a few quick illustrations, and you're going to hear a lot more about this in the rest of this webinar series. Here's an example of what I call a performance task frame. The students are asked to create a how-to guide to teach someone how to do something. Here's an example of a first grader who's created a how-to guide for something he knows how to do. Let's see if the video works. You can actually see it. How to break dance.
How to break it. Step 1. Put your head on the floor and your hands on the floor. I can't believe we're upside down. Step 2. Stand on your bottom fast. Step 3. Roll on your stomach. Step 4. Do it over again. This is how to break it.
So there's an example of a performance task built around what I call a task frame as a how-to guide. Now, that was first grade, and the 2 points I want to make about the example is, number one, you can have student voice and choice built into many tasks. He was the only child that wrote about breakdancing. Other kids picked other things. Secondly, you can use these task frames to build recurring tasks that go from simpler to more sophisticated. Here's an example of that same task idea applied in a high school government class. This was in the fall of 2020, before the pandemic shut down many schools. And this government class produced a voter's guide in conjunction with the 2020 presidential and congressional elections. Their guide was produced in social and distributed through social media, in print form. They even recorded a video that was shown on local cable channel. This is an authentic project engaging students in doing the subject, I would say. Now imagine a series of tasks and projects that build off of that same idea. Here's another quick illustration. The profile of a Ramsey graduate, the district in New Jersey, includes communication, and they have a set of essential questions. But interestingly, because they were looking for evidence of student growth in multimedia communication, they decided to have all fifth graders in the district have the opportunity to develop, research, develop and conduct or present a TED Talk in the spring of the year. Planning backward from that, they're building research skills. They have to write a script and get feedback. They have to learn a multimedia app in conjunction with their talk. As the talk gets closer, they practice their oral delivery and get feedback. And then they actually present in front of parents and fellow students. This is authentic communication. But these kinds of competencies don't develop one time. We work on them over time. So in Ramsey, they have plans for at least one time in middle school and at least one time in high school for students to do this again, albeit with different topic and maybe a more sophisticated challenge. These are examples of collecting evidence, performance-based evidence that shows application of learning and transfer, not just the ability to recognize the right answer from 4 alternatives. That's a different photo in our assessment album. Now, I noticed there was a question about AI, and there's a lot we could say just on this topic, but one of the ways we can use AI is to help us as educators create rich, authentic tasks and projects. I'll give you a very quick example of such. I asked ChatGPT to give me ideas for a project around designing a skateboard park. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but summarize it by saying it gave me what I thought was a very detailed summary of what a project could focus on in terms of objectives, what the students would actually produce as they went through this long-term project, how their work would be judged, including a important note at the bottom that if you're actually going to build construct the park versus just propose a plan and a budget, you would need to get approval, zoning, etc. Now, you don't have to go to ChatGPT, however. The sponsor of this webinar series, Defined Learning, has an extraordinarily rich collection of authentic performance tasks and projects. And many of you are familiar with Defined Learning, but if not, this is a way of working smarter. To me, don't reinvent wheels when there are good wheels out there. In conjunction with agreeing on important performance tests and projects, we would also want to agree on a well-developed rubrics that teachers can use for judging student performance, but also students can use for self-assessment. Here's just one example if we were working on tasks that involve mathematical problem solving. Here's an example of such a rubric that would be used when kids are working in teams on a project or engaged in a group activity. Now, what I recommend that we do this district-wide or at least school-wide, so we have common rubrics for important performances that we're working on in projects. And I recommend developing them for high school level, agreeing on them, and then working backward to have a simpler version for middle school if needed, upper elementary. And then a primary version might look like this. And notice this example is rubric-like with the 3 pumpkin face levels, but it's also framed in terms of self-assessment because we want students not just to wait to be told how they did, but to understand the qualities of good performance and be able to increasingly and effectively self-assess. And notice at the bottom on this format, what will you try to do better next time you work in a group? This transforms what could be simply an evaluation tool into a self-assessment and goal-setting tool, which arguably is one of the goals of a modern education, developing more self-directed learners who can self-assess and goal set based on feedback. All right, let me wrap up with my thoughts about these 2 questions. I made reference in the beginning to mapping the curriculum. So let me explicate that. Here's my view. In fact, a little history. The first generation of curriculum mapping was generated largely by the book that my longtime friend Heidi Jacobs wrote in 1989, Mapping the Big Picture. Heidi wrote about mapping the curriculum, and she called it diary mapping, and her idea was straightforward. It doesn't matter what's in the curriculum guide or even in the standards. What really matters is what teachers are actually teaching. To find that out, teachers were asked to map out what they taught for how long on a calendar map. So here's an example. This was a year-long map created by a social studies teacher, 6th grade. It doesn't tell us a whole lot except that this teacher spends 3 months on the topic of Europe, 2 months on Latin America, Canada in February, which makes me cold, etc. But the idea behind this was worthwhile. If there were other 6th grade teachers in the school or the district, we would ideally get together and share our maps. And we might find out that a different teacher was teaching Europe in the middle of the year, but starting off with, say, Africa, because he or she went to Africa and has lots of artifacts. And another teacher might be doing a different sequence. And then we could at least talk about, should there be some agreements? That was diary mapping version 1.0. When standards hit big time in the US and elsewhere in the world, Heidi suggested a shift from diary mapping done by individual teachers to consensus mapping done by teams. And this makes good sense. If we're obligated to standards, we should be coming together as a grade level or department team, looking at the standards, unpacking them, dissecting them, pardon me, and then mapping our curriculum accordingly. And there should be consistency among the teammates. Here's an example of such a curriculum map informed by UBD, by the way, where they have the big ideas for a unit, the essential questions to be explored, and interestingly, the performance tasks that will show evidence of understanding and transferability. Notice also, if you can read the small type, the last column, I love what they did. Rather than let the textbook dictate the curriculum, which is sometimes the case, they put the textbook in its proper role as a resource, but not the syllabus. That's how it should be, in my view. But here's my punchline for this section. I'm proposing we're ready for a new iteration that I call Curriculum Mapping 3.0. And here it is. If we plan the curriculum backward from long-term transfer goals derived from standards and 21st century skills or portrait for a graduate, it implies that we're going to map the curriculum around performances that we want students to be able to do, mapped backward from long-term transfer goals. So imagine a map of performance tasks and projects that call for understanding and transfer that would be simpler for younger children, but becoming increasingly sophisticated, authentic, and multidisciplinary as kids go up the grades. Now on the screen, apologize for the small type, but this is simply meant to be illustrative of this idea. Now, I framed this example through traditional disciplines, which is how most schools are organized. But there's nothing to say you couldn't have a map of projects that are multidisciplinary. And if you use defined learning resources, you might very well see that. But even in the disciplinary frame, as you see here, if you look at the parentheses below in each cell, I've listed some of the C's: critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, because those can be brought in as well. And even though it looks to be subject area siloed by the columns, if you look closely, many of these could in fact bridge between two or more subjects or disciplines. So this is an example. There's a lot more to say about this. And here's a shameless plug for a recent book in which I've described this idea, given more examples, and also task frames that can be used to map out such tasks. Later in this webinar, you'll be hearing from Michael, who has done this very thing for the CTE curriculum in his district in Texas. It's excellent work, and it's very much along these lines, so be on the lookout for that. I have included in the materials that you can access an article that describes Curriculum Mapping 3.0. So if you're interested in this idea, you can read about it and share the ideas with others. All right, my time is winding down, so let me briefly touch on this last question, and then we'll look at questions that you've posed. So how should we teach? This is the answer, or one of the questions in stage 3 of backward design. What kind of learning experience as instruction will we plan? Well, again, everything goes back to goals. If we're clear that we have different goal types, we need to be addressing those in our instruction. And my contention is there's not any one single best way of teaching. The best way of teaching is developing students toward the goals we want, but with the learners we have. So let me harken back to the athletic or game analogy and propose to think about it this way in our few minutes left. If you're clear about the game you want students to be able to play with what they're learning, in other words, think about your curriculum, not just as content to be covered, but as the performances you want kids to do, embodied through performance tasks and projects, then think like a coach. Because this is how coaches think. Coaches take the players they have and they develop their practices, right? Practices are our lessons equivalent. And in the practices, they have to learn the rules of the game. There's knowledge to be imparted. You can't play if you don't know the rules. There are skills that are developed, both individual and team skills, including the basic skills of the sports. Can't play if you don't have those basic skills. But we also develop understandings otherwise known as game strategy, because playing the game is more than just replicating a skill you did in practice. It's navigating the flow of the game, and you need understanding for transfer. But here's the big idea for me. I've never met a coach who says to me, "Oh, Jay, I don't have time for those games. They take all afternoon. How could I ever cover my playbook?" Right? That would seem silly, because the coach knows their job is preparing their players for the game. They use the playbook as a resource, but not the curriculum. And I propose that's how we should think about standards and textbooks. They are resources, but they're preparing students for the game, and we prioritize accordingly. So that's my idea. One last point before I stop my session. When it comes to understanding, this is for me a big idea. I like to say understanding must be earned. It must be earned in the mind of the learner. The teacher's role is to facilitate what I call meaning making. And meaning making requires active learning by the student. The teacher can advise, coach, facilitate, but the students have to do the work. That for me is the essential instructional and learning potential of project-based learning and / authentic performance tasks. We're asking students to perform with their knowledge, presenting them with realistic situations that replicate or simulate what people are doing in the workplace. Kids see it as relevant, it's engaging, and it results in deeper learning and prepares students for transfer. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I've thrown a lot at you in a short time, but I hope the ideas are interesting and will support the cause for future presenters that you'll hear in this webinar series. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy, and I think there may be some questions before I sign off.
Hi, Jay. There are a few questions, and if you let me share my screen, I'd like to put the slide back up for you to share with them your QAR to get access to some of your books and materials. But while I do that, one of the first questions I have is, do you see a difference between applying learning and transferring learning?
It's a great question. I see Eric Wade asked it, so thanks, Eric. Here's a short version. You can apply things in a fairly replicative or rote way. You know, everything from tie your shoe to kind of writing a 5-paragraph essay in a formulaic way. So application simply means you're doing something. But I appreciate this question, because for me, transfer has an important component that has to be laid onto application, and that is there needs to be some degree of novelty in what students are applying or the context for their application. Benjamin Bloom said this many years ago when he was working on Bloom's taxonomy. He said, if we really want to see understanding, there has to be some novelty. And that's different than rote learning, where you just give it back or apply something in a mechanical rote way. So that's the difference I see. Transfer involves applying your learning effectively to something that's new, that hasn't been told to you explicitly. Now, having said that, there are different degrees of novelty, and transfer. There's near transfer. Example, we're working with kids on arithmetic, and they're learning addition and subtraction, and we're using beans as an example. A transfer task might be, now let's do it when we go to the supermarket and work on apples. That's a pretty simple transfer. A far transfer would be an application of argumentation to a very different topic. But to summarize, Eric, great question. Transfer requires some novelty. You're applying your skills to something new.
Thank you, Jay. We have another question by JJ Ayers, which I love this question. It says, how will the use of AI change the focus of Understand by Design toward emphasizing the development of exploration of experiences?
Oh, great. Another great question. That's from JJ Ayers. I'll give you our time's short, so I'll give you a quick answer. I think AI tools have enormous potential for helping us with curriculum design, with assessment, and with teaching ideas. Let me highlight each briefly. You can ask, as I have done, ask ChatGPT, what are the big ideas, the big transferable ideas in a topic that I might be teaching? It can help us identify what should be a priority and a focus. We can ask ChatGPT to help suggest essential questions for exploring that topic. In terms of assessment, we can ask ChatGPT to give us ideas for performance tasks, projects, and rubrics. We're not going to take everything it gives us wholesale, but boy, it can give you a lot of good ideas just like that. And from a teaching point of view, ask ChatGPT to help you explain a concept for a 5th grader or a 10th grader. It gives some great ideas, analogies, and so forth. You can ask it to help you prepare a robust teaching sequence for a skill or process. So enormous opportunity. We should use it as a cognitive assistant.
Wonderful. And before you leave out, we have one more question from JJ. He wrote, how far do you go in creating the curriculum so that it is not so scripted that the teachers feel they cannot, it's not so scripted so that the teachers cannot adapt to the needs of the learners in terms of tier 1, 2, and 3 instruction?
Wonderful question once again. I'll give you my backward design answer. Whether it's a school or district curriculum, I propose that we need banks to the curriculum river. One bank is agreement on our goals, and I'm arguing we should identify and agree on long-term transfer goals, and you might say priority standards, especially for content. So there's not a lot of academic freedom or teacher freedom once we agree on the broad goals. The second bank of the curriculum river is evidence. I propose that we should agree at least on some core assessment evidence based on our goals. And I'm arguing that that evidence should include and be emphasizing, in fact, performance tests and projects. When we get to stage 3, which is how teachers teach, that to me is where academic freedom should reign. I don't think we should micromanage teaching or make it so lockstep that the teacher becomes robotic. We should honor teacher professionalism to work with the kids they have, to differentiate as needed, but we need to be clear about our goals and the evidence of achieving them. Look, a river needs banks to flow. Without those banks, we have a floodplain, and that's not good for kids or teachers. But we don't have to micromanage teaching in the way I suggested.
As always, it is a pleasure to have you with us, Jay, and sharing your work. For those of you who are interested, you can see the QAR to the far right of the slide I have up for more information on his books, award-winning, deep thinking. And what I always love about you, Jay, in these conversations is your strong, deliberate, and intentional belief in how we continue to help serve our students to become better thinkers and achievers. So thank you so much for spending time with us this morning.
My pleasure.